recently posted this video, where I took a look at some of the removed skills from Final Fantasy XIV's past, and honestly, it was a blast for me taking a trip down memory lane and seeing some of the cool, deranged, and just plain useless parts of the job that were implemented, and then taken away from the game piece by piece. The reception on that video was pretty good. Honestly, I think I underappreciated how much of it would be new or interesting information to a number of people, and a lot of old-timers like me got to feel that same sense of nostalgia. So today, now that we're on the cusp of the FF14 dawntrail release, in fact my very next videos will be based on the new expansion content itself, let's take one last look down memory lane before we look forward, shall we? Firstly, this entry was actually written for that last video, funnily enough, but I ended up cutting it, so why don't we begin the new video with a long lost snippet of the old video. Machinist had a few things that weren't tremendously impactful to the way they played, but I did kind of enjoy. Dismantle, before its recent reintroduction, was part of Launch Machinist's kit, but it only reduced incoming physical damage. Rend Mind was the equivalent ability for magic damage, and the animation and effect itself was kinda forgettable and you're not missing anything, but there's something about the name that I think is sick. Addle? Weak. Rend Mind? Now that's the good shit right there. Machinist also had Granado Shot as an alternative AoE skill. It was a circular attack rather than a regular conal like Spread Shot. If I remember rightly, Granado Shot actually did more damage than Spread Shot too, so you had one to use while the trash mobs were still grouping up, and another for once they're already in position. No wonder it got axed actually. So this is Shadow Flare. It's a ground-placed DPS ability that was shared between both Scholar and Summoner. It was pretty vanilla in terms of what it did. When it was originally implemented in A Realm Reborn, casting it would place it on the ground and would deal dot damage to all enemies within it. It lasted for 30 seconds and you could cast it whenever, so your main goal was to keep it on the floor at all times and have to refresh it as little as possible. Eventually in Stormblood this level of nuance was reduced a little bit, and it became a simple ability on a 60-second cooldown. You still needed to consider your placement carefully, but it was just like any other DPS cooldown in the game, in that if you just pressed it immediately, it would normally be okay for the most part. But the reason that I'm bringing it up today is because of one funny little line in its tooltip. Cannot be used with any other area creating actions. What other area creating actions could those jobs possibly have, I hear you ask? Only Sacred Soil. That's right, Sacred Soil and Shadow Flare would overwrite one another, and you could only have one active at a time. It's such an odd little quirk that I honestly forgot all about it until my static mate brought it up after they watched my last video, and it's so strange to think that these two intrinsic skills to the job just cancel one another out. Let's look at Warrior, because I think there are two interesting things I want to point out about it too. You know how every tank in FF14 has an invuln skill, which truly makes them the wall that protects the party? Warrior has had access to Holmgang since the release of A Realm Reborn all the way back in patch 2.0, but when it first came out, it wasn't an invuln at all. In fact, they didn't add the invulnerability effect until patch 2.1, after a single patch of Warrior being considered a useless meme job and most parties electing to take double Paladin instead. When it first released, Holmgang was literally just a bind on both you and the target. It also had a 6-second duration rather than the 10 that it has right now, even when it gained the additional ability to act as an invuln. It wasn't until Shadowbringers that the duration was buffed to 8 seconds, and then eventually to 10 in Endwalker. That wasn't the only Warrior cooldown that released in a near pointless state either. Shake It Off originally wasn't an AoE shield, or heal, or anything in between at all. When it was first implemented all the way back alongside Stormblood's release, it was literally just an AoE cleanse. That's it. It was an off-global, party-wide Asuna. Something insanely situational that was nearly useless in most of FF14's encounters, and so one patch later Square Enix completely reworked it into something that much more resembles the form that it takes today. What's really funny to me is they added and removed this AoE Asuna, as well as Fey Caress from Celine, which also had the same effect. And then the next expansion they added the Epic of Alexander to the game, which has a mechanic in which you need to cleanse 6 players in quick succession. I almost think they must have done it on purpose, honestly. Continuing on from that little sadistic touch, here's another. Dragoon's Lance Charge used to go by a different name, Blood for Blood. I actually still call it that, honestly, I just can't shake the habit no matter how hard I try. It increased your damage dealt, just like Lance Charge does now, but it also increased your damage received by a percentage as well. Usually this wouldn't be too much of a huge deal, and in most content it didn't affect anything at all. But there was one fight in particular that springs to mind as being problematic, shall we say. If you did the Unending Coil of Bahamut when it released in Stormblood, you'll probably remember this very well. The final phase of the encounter has you going up against Golden Bahamut, right? Through that 3-minute phase, you must survive 5 Titanic group stacks in the form of Mornifars, as well as a bunch of Busters and Exaflares. Well, based on the mitigation plans that many groups used at the time, there was one stack that had just a bit less mitigation than the others. I wonder what buff could be active on the Dragoon at the time. Sometimes Dragoons were even asked to click it off to ensure they'd be safe to take the hit. Like, can you imagine today being asked to click off your DPS buff because it might make you die? Different times. So White Mage used to have Fluid Aura, a skill that most of you will know as a largely useless knockback. I doubt anyone really missed its eventual removal, but in Heaven's Ward it used to do damage, making it an essential part of your DPS rotation that you would press a lot. Moreover than that, there was a bug that reared its head that would allow you to push away specific raid bosses, like Manipulator in A4. And here, I'm finally getting the opportunity to get this off my chest. When I found out about this, the first thing I did was queue in and try it out. And yes, people were confused and a little bit mad. And no, I don't regret a thing. I also want to look at 1 or 2 really cool role actions that I miss a lot. Now, you know in the last video I talked about Miasma 2 for how much I enjoyed that spell because of the level of risk-reward it implemented, providing you a constant juggling act with your mana pool as you walked the tightrope of maximizing damage without plunging into the pools below of running out of your essential healing resource. Well, Caster used to have a role action in Stormblood called Mana Shift that allowed it to divert an amount of its current pool to a target of choice. Think of the possibilities that this opens up for a moment. The healer just got res, and they really need a hand getting back on their feet. Mana Shift. They just did a big recovery and they don't have any resources left. Mana Shift. They pressed Miasma 2 one too many times and now they're in a bad spot. Mana Shift so they can use another one. Mana Shift was cool, and I'm sad that it's gone. Actually, speaking of mana economy, Stormblood also added a really weird spell to both healers and casters. Break is a role action that both of them shared, and I feel like most people never even pressed this button even once. It was a GCD with a measly 50 potency that also had the additional effect of applying a heavy for the target, an insanely long one at that too. But of course heavy isn't really going to get you anywhere in most of the game's content. The real benefit to Break was in recovery situations where your healer had just come off a res, or they basically had no mana reserves left. They still had a filler DPS spell that they could use to get off some damage, at least something. Kinda hilariously, I actually remember in Savage PF once running into a Break main healer, like a guy that unironically only used Break as his filler skill. Somebody else asked him why he was doing no damage at one point, and his response was that he wanted to always be prepared for a heal. I kinda respect the commitment, honestly. He's like the Ice Mage of healers, but way more committed. Speaking of weird stuff I doubt anyone ever used, Melee used to have a role action called Crutch. This removed Heavy and Bind from a target party member other than yourself. Yes, other than yourself, you couldn't even use it on yourself if you messed up. The only way you could get yourself cleansed is to hope the other melee had it on their hotbar too, so you can kiss and trade crutches. Casters also had Drain, and if you play Blue Mage you're going to recognise this immediately because it's been rebranded as a skill for them. Yep, it's Blood Drain. This would do almost no potency, and it hurt to use, but in exchange you'd get HP. I'm also making a very clear and direct effort to not talk about Protect here. Fuck, I just did. Protect existed, and it didn't add anything meaningful to encounters, and I thank Yoshi P that it's gone. Actually, can we mention Ring of Thorns really quickly here too? Not for any useful reason, just because the animation was really neat and it gives me an excuse to show off this cool old Dragoon skill. Seeing as I talked about Miasma 2 in the last iteration of this video, I'm contractually banned from bringing it up again, so I'm going to select a different scholar ability instead. Bane essentially allowed you to spread all your dots to all targets surrounding its recipient, and honestly I don't agree with its removal in the first place. Moreover than that, I'm reminding every Bard main here that it existed at one point, and yet Bards still don't have a way to spread their dots, and they probably never will. My question for you this time is a little bit different than before. Which ability do you hate? Which one do you wish would be removed from the game in a coming expansion so you don't have to deal with it anymore? I'd love to hear what people have to say about this, honestly. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.